Welcome to Whisky Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 862 for March 14th, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
We were shocked that it hadn't really changed that much in the last few years, despite the fact we know that more women are drinking whiskey. It seems almost year by year, but yet women are still an anomaly.
With more and more women working as distillers, blenders, and at the executive level in whiskey companies, one might think we'd finally be seeing some real progress in the way whiskey marketing campaigns portray women, as well as other long underrepresented groups. One would be wrong. OurWhiskey.com released a new study on how whiskey companies portray women in their social media campaigns this week for International Women's Day. Our Whisky co-founder, Becky Paskin, joined us on our Happy Hour webcast's Writers' Roundtable the other night to discuss the findings, along with Johnny McCormick of Whiskey Advocate. We'll share part of that conversation with you later on Whisky Cast in Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and
I can now stop beating people up here about the unfairness of these tariffs.
The news is next on this week's Whisky Cast.
Hey, whiskey fans, I'm Gabriel Cardarella, brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. You could probably guess I've got a lot of stories, but for me, the good ones have one thing in common. They're best told over a glass of whiskey. So hit pause, grab your bottle of Dewar's, and let's get back to this episode of Whisky Cast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Trying to fit the best of Ireland into one day, huh? Good luck. Takes us at least 12 years.
Happy St. Patrick's Day from Redbreast, proud sponsor of Whisky Cast.
Let's get started with the news. U.S. President Joe Biden signed the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan economic stimulus bill into law this week. We'll focus on just one part of that plan here. It includes around $28.6 billion in funding for grants to bars, restaurants, and other hospitality industry businesses to help them recover from the COVID-19 pandemic's economic impact. Distilleries with on-site tasting rooms and bars will be eligible for the grants, which can be used for rent or mortgage payments, as well as payroll expenses and inventory. That's important because pre-pandemic estimates showed that around 9 out of 10 U.S. distilleries depended on the revenue from their on-site sales for a major part of their annual revenue. Many of those tasting rooms and distillery shops have been closed for months at a time because of local public health restrictions. There's also additional funding in the stimulus package for payment protection program loans and other aid that will also be available to the hospitality industry. Last time around, I mentioned that Pittsburgh's Wiggle Whiskey plans to hire 99 new employees as it gradually ramps up its post-pandemic retail business. Wiggle went from a pre-pandemic 175 full and part-time employees to just 85 during the pandemic. Co-founder Meredith Meyer-Grelly confirmed to us this week in an email that they are hiring former workers back as part of the distillery's growth plan. With vaccination rates in the U.S. rising each week, Biden administration officials are expressing optimism about a slow, quote, return to normal. That optimism is also being felt in the bourbon capital of the world, Bardstown, Kentucky. Last fall's Kentucky Bourbon Festival in Bardstown had to become a virtual event, but tickets go on sale starting Monday morning for what will be the 30th edition of the festival. That's one of the big changes this year. Bourbon Festival President Randy Prasa joined us on the Friday night webcast to explain.
It's always been a free admission event, and partly because of COVID, but also partly because of the re-envisioned festival, we have decided to create a perimeter fence, an admission gate. So that's where the $10 comes in. Once you're inside the gate, there's going to be so many things that people are going to be able to do that is included in that general admission, including getting a wee Glencairn, an authentic Glencairn, the wee dram that we're going to be giving out to everybody at the gate to go out and sample for the first time. So it's taken us 30 years to get that part right, but you will actually be able to come to the Kentucky Bourbon Festival and sample from probably about 30 different distilleries, both the large heritage folks that you expect to see, but also a lot of the craft distilleries that we're putting emphasis on this year.
Let's talk about that, because it's going to mean a change on the lawn in front of Spalding Hall, where you've had arts and crafts displays and the big distillery stands for 28 years. Is that going to change? Because that was always open to all ages, but now it's going to be 21 plus, right?
Right. So it's going to be a little bit more of a serious focus on the adult side of the spirits industry. There'll still be arts and crafts, but a little bit more limited emphasis on those, and certainly a lot more emphasis on the sips to lips. So the large distillery displays that you have, that you mentioned, have been there. They will still be there on the lawn. It's that we've taken over more of the lawn. So we've got over across the street in front of the Bardstown City Hall is where the craft distilleries will be set up. We've gone from like the chow wagon and funnel cakes, kind of carnival food, to the food truck model. Plus, we'll still have some high-end culinary and bourbon pairing opportunities that will be that separate ticket that we talked about. So it'll be a pretty exciting visually change from what people have seen in the past, but also for if you haven't been there before, I'm thinking it'll be everything that people expect. If you close your eyes and envision a bourbon festival, you expect to be able to walk up and have interactions with all the brand ambassadors and the master distillers. And of course, with us being in the bourbon capital of the world, we've got access to all of the icons and the legends of the industry, as well as the up-and-comers that are currently in the craft category.
There will still be a few family-friendly events as part of the Bourbon Festival, which draws whiskey lovers from as far away as Australia each year. Ticket sales are being capped to comply with Kentucky's current limits on outdoor events, but Process says even if the state does relax those limits between now and September, the festival will not put additional tickets on sale to protect the health of visitors and distillery workers. You can watch our entire interview with Randy Prasa from this week's webcast at the WhiskeyCast YouTube channel. That concern over protecting distillery workers from exposure to COVID-19 has forced the Kentucky Distillers Association to cancel its plans for the annual Kentucky Bourbon Affair again this year. The event was planned for the week between the Bourbon Festival and the Bourbon and Beyond Music and Whiskey Festival in Louisville. Bourbon and Beyond has already been canceled. The Bourbon Affair is billed as a fantasy camp offering up-close experiences at participating distilleries. KDA officials said their member distilleries just are not ready yet to commit to opening up production areas to visitors right now. There has still been no decision made on whether the KDA will try to hold a Bourbon Hall of Fame induction ceremony as part of the Bourbon Festival in September. In other news, last week's decision to declare a 4-month ceasefire in the trade dispute between the U.S., Great Britain, and the European Union that led to the U.S. tariffs on some whiskeys and spirits is still being celebrated. That truce temporarily ends the U.S. 25% tariff on imports of single malt whiskeys from Scotland and Northern Ireland, along with Irish cream liqueurs and other liqueurs from around Europe. Ireland's ambassador to the U.S., Dan Mulhall, talked with reporters this week during an Irish whiskey online event sponsored jointly by the Irish Whiskey Association and the Distilled Spirits Council.
I can now stop beating people up here about the unfairness of these tariffs, and I intend to continue to argue for the removal of the tariffs on steel and aluminum exports from Europe into the US, and for the retaliatory tariffs that were imposed on US exports into Europe, including on US whiskey. So that I hope that this decision announced last week will be the start of a process that will lead to the elimination of all these tariffs, because frankly, all these tariffs are bad news. They're paid for by consumers, and they inhibit trade. They weaken both of our economies, and they should be removed, and we should get down to a more positive work on the trading relationship between the United States and the European Union, including Ireland, rather than being focused on these irritations which have been so much in the the limelight over the last 4 years.
Only about 2% of those bottles were subject to the U.S. tariff, which only affected Northern Ireland's single malts from Bushmills and a handful of other exporters. This is the time of year when we see a lot of new Irish whiskey releases, and this week we also saw a new release that is a retro reminder of the past. 2021 marks the 30th anniversary of the revival of Redbreast Irish whiskey back in 1991, when Irish Distillers was able to reacquire the rights to the brand. To mark the occasion, the Redbreast team went back another 20 years, when the Redbreast 10-year-old was available in Ireland, alongside the Redbreast 12-year-old for the last time before it came off the market in 1971. The revived Redbreast 10 was unveiled this week as a one-time exclusive for members of the Birdhouse, Redbreast's online fan club. Master blender Billy Layton told whiskey writers during Wednesday's online launch that the fun part was in creating it.
We took inspiration, but it was never going to be a recreation of the original. It just couldn't be a recreation because we don't have the same distillate as would have been around then. Distilling techniques have changed. Wood management, it is probably safe to say that it wouldn't have been as sophisticated as the wood management that we have now. So it's, it was the opportunity to take a cue from the past and interpret that into, what we had available in the way of distillate types and cask types that we could maybe pay homage to the original Redbreast 10-year-old.
Redbreast 10 is bottled at a cask strength 59.1% ABV. It's available only through the Redbreast website in select countries for €100 a bottle. Unfortunately, the U.S. is not one of those countries. I will have my tasting notes for it later on, and as a reminder, Redbreast is a sponsor of WhiskeyCast. While we'll have more of our discussion on gender diversity in a few minutes on WhiskeyCast in depth, Portland's Westward Whiskey released its second annual Women of Westward benefit barrel release on Monday during International Women's Day. Actually, there are two barrel releases, one exclusive to Oregon, and the second available nationally through Westward's website. Both barrels were picked by Westward's women executives and a team of women leaders within the spirits industry. That group includes Atlanta-based bartending guru Tiffany Barrier. Here she is from Monday's Zoom call.
I'm a sucker for women connection, women movement, the empowerment. We just don't see it enough, and it's always been seen as a cliquey thing, but this was the perfect click. Women have such a space in the whiskey category, and what Westward is doing is right up my alley. So getting these amazing samples to go through and taste with other women from different parts of the nation, backgrounds, education even, and our palates were personal, just to go through each one and taste it and figure out for one part, of course, what tastes great, but also what's really going to represent the brand, the six of us, and this moment that we can put, as history and mark this bottle perfectly and make some money to give away some money to some perfect charities.
Westward is donating 100% of the proceeds from each of the two barrels to two charities selected by the panel. Al Otro Lado works with the Latino migrant and refugee community in the U.S. Southwest and Tijuana, Mexico, and the Black Mamas Matter Alliance, which focuses on Black maternal health, rights, and justice. I'll have my tasting notes for one of those whiskeys later on. And finally, we have another celebrity entering the whiskey business. Actor Jamie Foxx has purchased a majority ownership stake in Heritage Distilling's Brown Sugar Bourbon brand. The Washington-based distillery first released Brown Sugar Bourbon back in 2018. It won World's Best Flavored Whiskey honors in Whiskey Magazine's World Whiskey Awards in both 2018 and 2019. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. Join us this Friday night at 5 p.m. New York time, and mind the time change elsewhere. It's 2100 GMT for the summer. For our live happy hour webcast, I'll be joined this week by Gordon Bruce, the distillery manager at Inverhouse's Knockdhu Distillery, which makes the Enoch single malts. Gordon will be here to answer your whiskey questions and tell us about his own podcast project that's in the works right now. That's Friday at 5 p.m. New York time on the WhiskeyCast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and, while it lasts, Periscope. Time now for the calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. A few event changes to note. The Stirling Whiskey Festival in Stirling, Scotland has been postponed. It was scheduled for May 8th, but will now take place on October 30th. Robbie's Whiskey Merchants in Ayr, Scotland had hoped to hold its annual Whiskey and All That festival on June 5th, but Robin Russell confirmed this weekend that they are now looking at dates for this fall. And the American Craft Spirits Association is pushing back its annual conference in Louisville, Kentucky from this July until December 4th through the 6th. Between now and then, tickets are still available for Billy Abbott's New Irish Whiskies online tasting with the Whiskey Exchange Wednesday night for St. Patrick's Day, along with a Writer's Tears and the Irishman virtual tasting at Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts that same night. Julio's also has a Whiskey Wednesday Rymagnac Project online tasting with Sagamore Spirit the following Wednesday on the 24th. Mcleod has its next whiskey auction on the 26th in Glasgow, Scotland. The Fredericksburg Whiskey and Wine Fest is on the 27th in Fredericksburg, Texas. The Whiskey Exchange has an online tasting of the Macallan Editions range March 31st. And Teeling Whiskey Company is presenting an online Easter chocolate and whiskey pairing class April 1st. No April Fool's joke there. The Whiskey Obsession Festival is set for April 8th in Tampa, Florida. The Nth Universal Whiskey Experience is April 20th and 21st in Las Vegas. And Whiskey Live Melbourne will be on May 7th and 8th in Melbourne, Australia. As always, remember that all in-person events are subject to change on very short notice, depending on local public health restrictions. We do update the calendar at whiskycast.com throughout the week as we get word on event changes, along with adding new events to the list. If you're planning a whiskey event, whether it's in person or online, please use the contact form at whiskycast.com to let us know about it, and we'll be glad to add it to our list. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states and 3 continents, and online too. Visit the Where to Buy page at catoctincreekdistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskeyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskeyCast In Depth is brought to you by the Distiller's Edition Collection. Stereotypes. We've all seen them in whiskey ads over the years, and even the most chauvinistic men are likely to shake their heads today at the way women were often shown in those ads from, not that long ago. This past Monday was International Women's Day. 3 years ago, whiskey writer Becky Paskin and longtime brand ambassador Georgie Bell launched OurWhiskey.com on International Women's Day. Their goal, to not only push the whiskey industry to hire more women and get rid of the gender stereotypes in whiskey marketing, but to also do the same thing for people of color, the LGBTQ community, and other groups that have been underrepresented for so long. This week, OurWhiskey.com released the findings of a new study looking at the way whiskey brands represent women in social media. Becky Paskin joined us on Friday night's Happy Hour webcast for one of our Writers' Roundtable discussions, along with Johnny McCormick of Whiskey Advocate magazine. Here's a lightly edited part of our conversation about the study.
We were really looking at how women and men and people of colour were represented in whiskey brand social media content over the last 5 years. So we took 150 of the best-selling and most influential whiskey brands that are active on Instagram, and we tallied up how many times women were featured and how many times men were featured. So there was a question which you just posed, which was, were there any surprises or was it depressingly familiar? Now, we actually did run a very small test study a few years back. So we looked at just 2017, 2018, and we only took a sample size of 15 brands at that point. And at that point, I think the figure came out at 20% of posts that feature people feature women. And we thought, well, that's terrible. There are so many women working in the whiskey industry and there are so many women enjoying whiskey. Why are we not seeing more of them in social media marketing? So what we decided to do was, let's take a bigger sample this time. Let's look at it over 5 years. Let's do it properly and do an actual study. So what came out of that was in 2020, of all of the posts that these whiskey brands put out that featured people, so we counted the people-centric posts, women featured in 36 of those posts, whereas men featured in 82% of those posts. So there's a huge disparity in the number of women being represented in social media marketing. So that's women who are being represented as whiskey drinkers and as people working in distilleries. We knew that these figures would come out because we'd done this sort of interim study before, but we were shocked that it hadn't really changed that much in the last few years, despite the fact we know that more women are drinking whiskey. It seems almost year by year, but yet women are still an anomaly. And in fact, one of the studies that we did as well was how often brands posted about International Women's Day. And obviously that just went on Monday. So, and I don't know about you guys, but I saw so many brands posting about International Women's Day, which was great. But what we found was that in 2020, only 29 of the 150 whiskey samples posted about International Women's Day, yet female representation throughout the entire year was only at 39%. So they're posting about it, saying how much they love women, but then ignoring them again for the rest of the year. So what we didn't want to do with this report was to point a finger at the industry and say, you're crap, you need to, you're awful and we hate whiskey. Obviously, that's not the point here. What we wanted to do was just hold up a mirror and say, look, there is a problem. There is something that needs to be done. And we do have ideas about how this can be rectified. And we are offering advice. The report itself, we are making that available to brands and distributors and marketers, so people in the industry, to purchase that report. It's quite a big report. Here's Isla, by the way, for people who are asking. She's using me as a climbing frame right now. We are making that report available for the industry to purchase, and what comes with that is also some consultancy, so we can actually speak to them about their brands and offer some bespoke advice for how they can maybe improve the representation, not just of women, but intersectionally as well, people of colour and different ethnicities and all sorts of backgrounds, disabilities, LGBTQ, etc. as well. So
Can I just make a devil's advocate argument here, and not to discount your work in 2020 and on this report at all, because I completely support what you're doing. But one of the things I noticed was because International Women's Day last year in 2020 fell 3 days before the start of the pandemic, as we all know. And I know a lot of brands immediately cut back as soon as the death tolls started rising. They cut back their social media, and because they didn't want to be seen as marketing during a pandemic. And I'm wondering if that might have made a difference last year, if they'd had a normal year, if they would have been able to increase their representation.
So we
follow through on that.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. We found that so obviously we charted how many times brands posted about International Women's Day between 2016 and 2020. We also charted Mother's Day posts as well, by the way, and Father's Day posts. International Women's Day, I think in 2016 there were I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think it was something like 9 brands posted about it, and it was a very small incremental increase year on year. So it actually didn't make much of a difference at all, Mark. I think this year it's more front of mind. So I would imagine by the time we come to run this report next year, we would have seen a bigger increase. But I also hope that next year as well, we'll see a larger increase of female representation across the board anyway. So we'll see.
We can only hope. I mean, it's something that needs to be done.
One thing we did find, and I'll tell you this wasn't in the press release we sent out or anything that we've actually put out there, but we did find that between 2019 and 2020, obviously the pandemic was with us for the whole of 2020, there was an actual, the number of people posts that went out were the same pretty much. There was a very small decline, but the number of women being represented dropped by about 8% in the year. And I'm guessing, and this is our insight on this, is that it's maybe a representation of a lack of women in distillery operational roles and women in ambassador roles, because what we saw was a lot of brands would turn to their ambassadors to generate content themselves, or maybe during those periods where distilleries are opened up, they're taking photos of their distillery operators doing the work and pulling things together, bottling, making hand sanitizer, etc., and just featuring fewer consumers and obviously doing fewer marketing photo shoots. So that's all that we can potentially project onto that actually that decline in 2020 is really reflective of how few women there are, how a fewer amount of women in those production roles.
Were there any positives in the... Go ahead. I'm sorry, Johnny, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what sort of response have you had from the industry, Becky? Have you had individual brand response, or do you feel they're coming back with a unified response?
So far, we've had a really great response from the industry. We've had a ton of brands, especially the big ones, really interested in working with us on this. So we've had requests for the report from all of the usual big suspects, the main suspects. So I'm really, bearing in mind this has only been out for a week and this report's going to last a year, I'm so encouraged by the response that we've had from the industry. Everybody... I don't imagine for a second that the whiskey industry wants it to be an exclusive industry and not welcoming to women and not welcoming to people at all. I think that they genuinely don't see it, and that is that's on unconscious bias, and we all suffer from it. I suffer from unconscious bias. Everybody does. So I really believe it's just on that. So I think with just a few small steps, the industry can really make it a more inclusive place. And it doesn't have to take a lot. And it's not, as I said before, this isn't about pointing a finger. This isn't about placing blame. This is opening people's eyes to the fact that something just needs to change. And there are simple ways to do that.
And it's very true because,
No, go ahead, Johnny. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, whilst women belong in all places in the whiskey industry, and I think from our roles, we often see women in all sorts of different roles that you don't see, as you say, in social media in their coverage, in that there are far more women in all sorts of different roles both in distillery operations and blending side, in marketing and in management. But it's trying to get that visibility of those roles is what's missing, and it's making sure that those people are seen and heard, and so that inspires other people to look at whiskey as a career.
Yeah, exactly. It has a two-pronged benefit to it. One is inspiring other women to maybe look at whiskey as providing those career paths that they never would have considered before because of its associations with it being a masculine drink, so they just don't consider it. The other one is also to encourage more women to maybe try whiskey for the first time, or to have the confidence to maybe try a little bit more, explore it a bit more, because they see more women drinking it themselves. And it's a really interesting one. I just saw a question with, but how do we feel women were being represented in general? So we, for the report, for the most part, just counted how many times women and men featured in posts. What we didn't necessarily do this time around, we noticed it and we took kind of anecdotal notes, was how were those women represented in those posts? Because the story, the relationship between the characters in an image tells a huge story. So if you have a bottle of whiskey in the foreground and a man in a suit with his tie, and then a woman in the background, and she's a bit blurry, but it's just her in like a short red dress with her bare knees just crossed over. What kind of message is that sending? And then in relation to the caption too. And we've seen a lot of posts over the years. I'm glad to say the worst offending posts were in like 2016, 2017. And actually they're related mostly to one particular category, or one or two particular categories. And as part of I think the press release we sent out, we did say which were the better categories at representing women overall. I'm pleased to say that Scotch did extremely well. I think it was something like 34%, 24% women overall, which was great.
The implication of whose whiskey that is and who's enjoying it and what's happening in that scenario. But 2016, 2017 is frighteningly close by. Although we've talked about this before, calling out a brand when they did a press release that said, this is the whiskey for every occasion and for every man, or whatever. And you're going, why cut off 50%? And that was, I'm sure, 2016 or 2017. It's about the same sort of time.
Well, I saw a press release
I've
like
never seen one since.
Just last year. I saw one last year. There was one. Yeah, there was one that came out from a PR company for a Scotch whiskey brand, calling it the gentleman's drink. And let's not also forget as well the way that whiskey is also always pitched as a perfect gift for the man in your life, the perfect gift for Father's Day. But how often do you see press releases coming out pitching whiskey for Mother's Day? And I was just down in a supermarket earlier today, walking past, it's Mother's Day on Sunday here. So I was walking around and seeing all the Mother's Day gifts. And of course, there's like bottles of gin and pink things and candles and flowers and jugs with mum written on it. And who the hell's going to buy that crap?
Prosecco and...
There is no whiskey involved in that conversation, because whiskey isn't considered something that women drink. As we know, 35% of whiskey drinkers are female, and that's only ever going to increase. So what if, and actually, so some of the research that we've got does actually show that the amount of brands that are now taking Mother's Day seriously is increasing, which is so interesting. I think that that's only going to grow more and more as we know more women drink whiskey. So why not think, well, it's a gifting occasion. Why are you ignoring it?
Yeah. You're doing your list. We don't want the pink bin. We don't want, the pink whiskey. Whiskey for girls. It's not. It's for everybody. That's the thing.
But I have to say, I did see an email come into my inbox from the Whisky Exchange. Just their regular consumer newsletter came into my emails this last week, talking about gifts for Mother's Day generally, and there was whiskey involved in that conversation too. So well done, Whisky Exchange, for doing that. I think that just should be the normal line. Let's just include every spirit category, every wine category, beer, whatever, within gifts for Mother's Day, because women drink and eat whatever the hell they want to. Let's not restrict them to pink sparkly gin. Poor things.
So who's doing things right, in your opinion, Becky?
Well, I think it's difficult to say that there are obviously some brands that came out of our report having like the best figures when it came to female representation. 90%. There was one brand which had 100%, but it was an anomaly, to be honest. Let's remember that a high amount of female representation is great, but where exactly is the brand positioned? Is that equal? If you have 90% female representation in your branding and marketing, surely that's just flipping the argument back the other way. What we're talking about is having an equal number of men and women, maybe not in every single post. And this is, for some reason, something people can't get their heads around. Or how can you have diversity in every single post and you can't represent absolutely everyone? And that's not the aim here. The aim is to even it out over the year. So it's not all just the guys gathering around, watching the game, having their bourbon in front of them, not celebrating at the end of the day, not giving a bottle of whiskey to their dads. Let's include women in the conversation. That's all we're asking, is have a roughly equal number of men and women, and have women featured in normal occasions, drinking whiskey, neat and in cocktails, wearing normal clothes, so as they would normally be, and not necessarily models either. So normal women in normal occasions. The brands that are doing really well, I talk about these brands all the time, so this will come as no surprise, but I love what Glenlivet does. I have heard from some people in the industry, they think that it's too female focused, but the figures don't necessarily say that, I'm sorry to say. But Glenlivet is fantastic at, I think, bringing whiskey into the modern age. It's so fresh and so vibrant. I love the branding and the mixture of men and women in there. Glenmorangie's new campaign is fantastic. It's amazing. It's men and women, people of different ethnicities and backgrounds. It's even challenging. There's a hint at LGBTQ there as well. It's everything, and it speaks to. I don't know if anybody watching has seen the new Glenmorangie campaign, but I had a tear in my eye watching it, because it was the first time that I'd seen a whiskey brand marketed to me. I'd never been marketed to before by a whiskey brand before, and not in a purposeful, we're going to pitch this at women. It was, this is for everyone and we're going to include everyone, and it's modern and it's interesting, and that's all I wanted to see. And it was just like, oh my God, we're finally there. We finally got something which makes sense to not just me, but to so many other people as well. So Glenlivet, I love. Glenmorangie is brilliant. Jack Daniels generally is pretty damn good with their marketing. They have a great mixture of men and women, and they challenge those gender stereotypes really well too. So that's just a handful of them off the top of my head, but there's plenty more that I think are fantastic, and we do hope to celebrate some of them over the coming year as well.
You can watch the entire discussion from Friday night's Happy Hour webcast on the WhiskeyCast YouTube channel, and it includes the Glenmorangie TV ad that Becky referred to. That ad is all visuals and music, so it doesn't have quite the same impact here on a podcast. We've also included a link to the key findings from the OurWhiskey.com study in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. That's WhiskeyCast in Depth, brought to you by the Distiller's Edition collection lineup of single malts from Diageo's Classic Malts. Look for the new 2020 editions of Oban, Talisker, Lagavulin, Cragganmore, Dalwhinnie, and Glenkinchie at a whiskey shop near you. Get all the details at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the Women of Westward Benefit Barrel No. 2. This is the single malt that will be available nationally. Barrel No. 1 was the Oregon-only release. This one is bottled at 45% ABV and is almost 5 years old. The nose has notes of fresh berries, red grapes, peaches, apricots, and hints of caramel, honey, and vanilla, along with subtle spices. The taste has a nice balance between baking spices, fresh raspberries, apricots, and dried flowers for a luscious flavor. The finish? Well, it's long and buttery smooth, with dried fruits and gentle spices. It is one of the best Westward whiskeys I've had yet. I'm scoring the 2021 Women of Westward Benefit Barrel No. 2, a 93. GlenDronach has released 4 new single cask bottlings for the U.S., all selected by master blender Rachel Berry. I had the chance to taste all 4 the other day with Rachel, and we'll focus on the oldest of the bunch. It's a 27-year-old ex-Oloroso sherry cask that was filled back in 1993. Cask number 7102 came in at 51.4% ABV. The nose is gentle, mellow, and complex, with touches of molasses, dates, berry cobbler, chocolate-covered cherries, raisins, and subtle spices. The taste comes on slowly, but the wait is worth it. There's a great balance between dark fruits, dates, figs, black cherries, and subtle touches of baking spices. The finish? It's long, well-balanced, and gentle. This one is outstanding. I'm scoring the GlenDronach 1993 single cask number 7102, a 96. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Want to find out how Sagamore Spirit is reviving and evolving the tradition of Maryland-style rye whiskey, including its new tequila cask-finished rye. In-person tastings are available once again at the distillery in Baltimore, but you'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They're offering WhiskeyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. If you buy bottles from your local retailer, a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through each whiskey. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com and use the code WhiskeyCast, all one word, to access. Please drink responsibly. I've mentioned Canadian Club's 43-year-old Chronicles series release, The Speakeasy, in the last couple of episodes, after it won Canadian Whiskey of the Year honors in last month's Canadian Whiskey Awards. I received a sample this week. It's bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has notes of dark chocolate fudge, toffee, a touch of red apples, subtle spices, and just a hint of oak. The taste is very complex. Caramel candy and dark chocolate fudge build a foundation for spicy touches of white pepper, ginger, and allspice notes, while hints of toffee, oak tannins, and red apples linger in the background. The finish is very long as the caramel and dark chocolate fudge combine with oak to provide that stage for the spicy notes to fade away slowly on. All I can say is, wow. I'm scoring Canadian Club's Chronicles 43-year-old The Speakeasy a 95. And since it's St. Patrick's Day week, let's look at a couple of new Irish whiskies. Clonakilty has collaborated with 11 different craft breweries on cask finishes and has just released its latest collaboration with Maryland's Manor Hill Brewing, an Irish whiskey finished for 6 months in barrels used for Manor Hill's Baltic Porter beer. It was first matured in ex-bourbon barrels and was bottled at 48.5% ABV. The nose is dry with a hint of oak sawdust and touches of honey, vanilla, caramel, citrus, milk chocolate, and a slight hoppiness. The taste has a good balance of sweetness and spice, with citrusy lemon and lime notes, complemented by chili peppers. The spiciness fades slowly to reveal hints of honey, vanilla, and caramel. The finish is long and spicy with that underlying combination of citrusy tartness and sweetness. I'm scoring the Clonakilty Manor Hill Baltic Porter cask finish a 93. And I can't go without sharing my tasting notes for the new Redbreast 10-year-old limited edition. It's bottled at 59.1% ABV, as I mentioned during the news. The nose is very complex, with hints of old leather, brown sugar, roasted almonds, subtle spices, dark fruits, mint, and menthol. The taste starts off intensely with oak and baking spices, in a good balance with hints of figs, marzipan, blackberries, and molasses. Adding a few drops of water to this one will bring out a touch of dark chocolate, too. The finish fades away slowly with fruity sweetness, brown sugar, and oak. This one is supposed to be a one-time-only release, but I'd really like to see it stick around for a while. I'm scoring the Redbreast 10 Limited Edition a 95. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 3,100 whiskeys from around the world at whiskycast.com. Check it out this week.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Gabriel Cardarella again, the Doers Guy. I've seen a lot in my years as brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended scotch. Like the time I got a hold of an actual letter written by Andrew Carnegie, a letter from 1891, in it asking Doers to ship a keg of whiskey to President Benjamin Harrison at the White House. Spoiler alert, we did. And the bourbon folks were not too happy about it. Pretty cool, right? Well, here's another story for you. In 2019, our master blender, Stephanie Mcleod, became the first woman to be awarded Master Blender of the Year by the International Whiskey Competition. And a year after that, she won it again. Stephanie's first creation for Doers 15 year, is another piece of history. Sweet, floral, with notes of honey and toffee, a perfectly balanced addition to the Doers lineup. It's a great introduction to scotch for beginners, and it's more than complex enough to satisfy whiskey aficionados. So grab some Doers 15, call some friends, and make a few stories of your own. That's what a good bottle of whiskey is all about.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. I just shared my tasting notes on that Canadian Club Chronicles 43-year-old a couple of minutes ago. When I received the sample bottle this week, I posted a photo of it on social media. Torsten Andersen in Denmark posted this comment on LinkedIn. Trust they ship complimentary samples to Old Distinguished Canadian Club Society members, with a grinning emoji. That's above my pay grade, Torsten. The other day, I finally tracked down a bottle of Blue Spot Irish whiskey at my local grocery store's liquor shop. To give you an idea of the demand for this one in the U.S., they got 3 bottles in that morning. I walked in just before noon and got the last one, and I paid the list price of $85 for it. Feel free to get a little bit angry when you hear this tweet from Chris D'Amato in the Washington, D.C. area. So, given the list price, I take it $430 to $500 is a complete ripoff. Oh yeah, that is clearly a retailer taking advantage of the demand. Remember, in some U.S. states, it's actually illegal for whiskey makers and distributors to dictate pricing to retailers. The retailers are free to charge whatever they think they can get for a whiskey. Feel free to call them out on it when you catch them. I caught a different local store trying to sell a couple of Parker's Heritage Collection bourbons for $400 each the other day. Not only was the list price for each of those 2 whiskeys a lot lower, but Heaven Hill donates part of its proceeds from each bottle to the ALS Association. I'll guarantee you this retailer isn't matching that donation. And finally, that Blue Spot bottle completed my collection of all the spots. Blue, green, yellow, and red spot. And when I shared a photo on Twitter, @BunkEyeH suggested that there had to be a Dr. Seuss joke in there somewhere, followed by this: I will not try green spot and ham, not with a goat, in a boat, not even a dram. Oh, that's just sad. Green spot and Kentucky country ham go really well together. If there's something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WhiskeyCast. The email address is comments@whiskeycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Since it is St. Patrick's Day week, it seems appropriate to share a bit of Irish whiskey history and trivia, thanks to our good friend, Irish Distillers archivist Carol Quinn. You may have seen old Irish whiskey ads for Redbreast and other whiskeys that referred to them as whiskey liqueurs. Today we think of liqueurs generally as something else altogether. They're bottled below 40% ABV, with herbs or flavorings added to the whiskey. But back in the day, the term whiskey liqueur was used to refer to Irish whiskies that were at least 12 years old. Of course, those whiskeys were hard to find, given that most Irish whiskies were a lot younger. Back then, W.A. Gilby & Sons owned the Redbreast brand, and Carol takes it from here.
It wasn't widely available. It was only known by a certain few. Now, you could get it reasonably easy in Dublin, a lot more difficult around the rest of the country. And it was quite expensive. So you're not talking about an everyday whiskey here. It was something almost quite exclusive. And there's actually a funny story about that. Gilby's, as well as being spirit bonders, also sold wine. And they had the concession for altar wine in Ireland. So they were distributing altar wine to the parish priests around the country. And the savvy parish priest would kind of look in the back of the van and see the bottle of Redbreast and say, well, maybe add that to the bill as well. And Redbreast became known as the priest's tipple. So you mightn't find it in your local pub, but you could find it in the local parish priest's house.
At least it's a lot easier to find today. Here's hoping you have a good St. Patrick's Day. By the way, never ever refer to it as Paddy's Day. That's because Paddy would be a nickname for Patricia. Paddy, with 2 D's, refers to Padraig, which is the traditional Irish Gaelic version of Patrick. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot. The tears of Ireland's great writers, bursting with flavour, humour and angst. Bottled for you to taste. No writers were harmed in the making of this premium Irish whiskey. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of Whiskey Cast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course our complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. I love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever wondered where Redbreast got its name? Well, let's go back to 1912 and be glad our bird-watching founder didn't spot the bar-tailed godwit that day.
Proud sponsor of WhiskeyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
At Doers, we love a good story, and that's why we're always writing new chapters. Like our Illegal Smooth finished in mezcal casks. With notes of sliced green pepper and a wisp of smoke, a world's first, Illegal brings cultures together for something truly unique. As a 174-year-old brand, we could rest on our laurels. Instead, we'd much rather continue writing. Because when you keep telling the same old story, that's when people stop listening.
Whiskey Cast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.